This video is about disability, gender and law and issues of employment for people with disabilities. There are a range of employment barriers for people with disabilities, including things such as costs of accessibility, that is the provision of accessible premises or assistive technology, which some employers assume is prohibitive. There can also be discrimination, and there are still a lot of myths about the ability of people to work with a disability. I actually used to work with a very intelligent professor who happened to use a wheelchair and who had been a wheelchair athlete in the past and was actually advised when she first became a wheelchair user by hospital staff that she could perhaps look at jobs in a sheltered workshop on extremely minimum wages. She hadn't actually had an intellectual disability, and such places are common employers for people with intellectual disabilities. So the assumption was that by being a wheelchair user, she would be unable to have any job involving intellectual endeavour. So that's a little anecdote. In addition, there's some real issues around so-called sheltered workshops and the fact that they often pay people substantially less than minimum wage, and there have been cases on that which have said that due to the additional requirements for assistance and supervision that is acceptable. There can also be some issues around employers being inflexible. In the vast majority of cases, people with disabilities are able to work all sorts of jobs so long as there is some flexibility around how they address that job and how they do it. There are also a range of myths about the productivity of people with disabilities, that they are often alleged to be not as productive as their abled peers. The Disability Discrimination Act at the Commonwealth level and the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act both ban discrimination on the grounds of disability. And they both ban both indirect and direct discrimination. That is, you can't refuse to hire someone with a disability or make requirements not directly required by the job that screen out persons with a disability. So you can't require someone necessarily to stand for 8 hours for a job if the job can also be done sitting, if that would have the effect of preventing persons who use wheelchairs from being able to do the job. Both acts require list disability as a ground for discrimination, as well as perceptions around disability and the having of a disease or a condition which may be assumed to be a disability. They also list employment and several other grounds as reasons not to discriminate, but in this case I'm talking about employment, and they require employers to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate persons with disabilities. However, that is limited by any situation which would cause unjustifiable hardship for the employer and also the inherent requirements of a job. So if there are real requirements for a person to be able to run, then you are allowed to refuse to hire persons with a mobility impairment. On the other hand, if there is no actual requirement for that, or there's no actual requirement that a person not have a disability, and it's possible to make reasonable adjustments, then the employer is required to do so. Unfortunately, many people in our society tend to see disability as an add-on. That is, oh, I'll build the building and then I'll figure out where to put the ramp, rather than having planning for disability come right at the start of their planning process. So that can actually be a real problem for people with disabilities. The same provisions also apply to people in education, and that we of course have to make reasonable adjustments to assist anyone with a disability. If you do have a disability and aren't registered with our disability services folk, go and see them. They'll tell us what we need to do to ensure that you have full accessibility. There can also be real issues around access to social security and welfare payments for persons with disabilities. The first is that a person must show they're unable to work to have disability pension or similar payments made to assist them. To do this requires a certain number of points that are then added up to see if the person's unable to work. However, that is often assessed by non-specialists, and while people with some types of disabilities are readily seen to be unable to work, mobility impairments, etc., in other situations such as mental health issues, this can be really difficult. And I'm aware of at least one situation where a person with a mental health disability actually had doctor's reports clearly placing them and using wording that placed them directly in a point scale that would mean they were eligible for pensions. They literally said they have more than 20 points of impairment, and that was still refused by Social Security. There can also be, if a person's not eligible for disability-specific payments, then a person may have to meet mutual obligation requirements, often liaising with private employment providers. And this can be a real difficulty for persons with disabilities, where they may be expected to interview or take jobs which are highly unsuitable for the person with the disability, or risk losing their Centrelink payments. So it can be a real trap and a real difficulty for people who are underemployed or unemployed due to disabilities.